All right. I think we are going to get this event, this little mini conference started. Thank you for everybody for coming here in person, and then we've got a bunch of folks online as well, including I'm getting apologies from people at CBO. Apparently, there's something called reconciliation going on right now. But thank you all very much for coming. I hope this is going to be both an interesting and productive little event. The kind of run of show, I'll give a very brief introduction, then we're going to have Amitabh Chandra and Alice Chen give short talks. We'll take a little bit of a break, and then Chris Adams is going to close out. In terms of framing, I'll be very brief. I think to me, the basic idea here is that I think there is a generally accepted sort of tension in this space. How much we spend and how we spend money on drugs affects the incentives of people who are thinking about whether they're going to invest in making those kind of products. That I don't think there's a lot of disagreement about. Where there is disagreement and where there's genuine uncertainty is about the nature of that relationship. How strong is that relationship? What are the sort of intricacies of how policy X changes the incentives of a firm and how that actually ripples through to the products they bring to market down the road, let alone what it means for patient welfare. So those questions are much, much more difficult to answer, yet those are the questions that really dominate policy discussions about this issue. So the idea today is, when I look around, all of the things that people in this room write, that I write, cite like the same 5 or 6 papers on this topic over and over and over again, and there's nothing wrong with those papers, but I think it reflects the fact that we just don't have that many natural experiments to pull from to really get some evidence about the empirical realities of this relationship. And so the idea of today is to try and push that frontier forward and improve our ability down the road to forecast how policies are going to change behavior. All right. And so in terms of the run of play, we're going to start with Amitabh Chandra, who's a professor at the Kennedy School and he's a visitor here at AEI. He's going to present some evidence on the IRA itself. How big of a deal is this? How much is this really changing incentives of drug makers? And how does that put into context some early evidence on what we're seeing their behavior actually do, or how it actually changes? Then Alice Chen is professor at the University of Southern California, is going to explore a topic that I think is one of the areas where additional new research is really, really valuable. In particular, there's a lot of focus on how policies might change the number of drugs that come to market, but a huge chunk of the discussion is actually about the composition of those drugs. The IRA, there was tons of discussion about how Medicare negotiation was either going to affect really, really valuable products or it was only going to affect these products of negligible value. Most of those statements had almost no empirical basis behind them. And so she's going to help us sort of push the frontier a little bit forward on that question. And then finally, we'll have Chris Adams present. I'm having flashbacks to email exchanges with CBO. It's not a new model, it's just a model that's different than the old model, but it's still the old model, it's just new. The new version of how they're modeling this question of how policies and legislative proposals affect innovation, but we'll get to that down the road. So to start things off, Amitabh Chandra, 20 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions, and then we'll repeat that for each speaker. So please join me in welcoming Amitabh Chandra.
Thank you. What do I do to get my slides up?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Green button. Green button.
The green button. All right. Excellent. Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about a project that I was part of that was done with my colleague and friend Matt Vogel, who is a scholar at the Harvard Kennedy School. He's a D. Shaw person by way of background. Rena Conti, who's a professor at Boston University. And here's what we tried to answer in this paper. The IRA is an incredibly complex piece of legislation, right? And at a very high level, it sort of has 2 pieces that are extremely relevant to pharmaceutical companies. The part that got a lot of attention in the press was the drug price negotiation or drug price regulation piece of it. So, after 9 years, the price of small molecule drugs will be regulated. After 13, the price for large molecule drugs will be regulated. So the question we wanted to ask in our project was a simple one. Everybody was saying that this was going to be an incredibly large existential threat to the incentives for innovation. And so we wanted to understand, Is that possible? Like, how big of a threat could this be? And so what we do in this paper is we say, suppose the IRA had passed in 2012. Suppose. How many drugs would have had their prices negotiated by the IRA from 2012 to today? Right? And can we make assumptions? So that would be looking at actual revenues of these drugs and their actual Medicare shares. And then that allows us to say, well, what if CMS demanded a 30% discount? What if CMS demanded a 50% discount? And then you would have a number which would tell you what share of revenues could be negotiated by the government and what the revenue fall would be. And then we can all have a discussion around, is that meaningful for innovation? What we're not doing in this paper is studying the Part D redesign. So that's a consequential piece of legislation that has very large implications for plans and PBMs and consequentially pharmaceutical companies. We are not modeling any piece of that here. So I have nothing to say. I'm very interested in that, but I am not going to be talking about that today. Okay, so that's our paper. And so then by way of background, I think, this was sort of the climate about 2 years ago. Lilly, for example, said that they had scrapped a $40 million small molecule asset in part because of the IRA. Vas Narasimhan told Barron's that his company Novartis had stopped the development of an early stage cancer drug. Right? And lots of other companies like Genentech have to make decisions not only about whether to advance a small molecule drug, but whether they want to delay the launch of a small molecule drug. Like suppose you have a drug that has an indication in ovarian and an indication in prostate. Normally you would have launched the indication in ovarian, that's a small indication. Then later you get the big prostate indication. But the IRA certainly creates incentives to delay the ovarian launch, because by doing that, you get like 9 years of revenue on prostate cancer. So how should we think about all of this? So what I'm going to do is think about the class I teach at Harvard Business School. It's called Investing in Life Sciences. It's a finance class, so we're just going to apply the tools of finance to this problem. So here's what we're going to do. We will look at all the drugs. Like let's assume that the IRA had been in full force in 2012. Full force, right? So like lots and lots of drugs are having their prices negotiated. So we start with a sample of 290 drugs that had at least $200 million of gross Medicare revenue, because that is the threshold. That is the threshold for negotiation by the IRA. That's 290 drugs over the entire time period. So that's what I mean by CMS is not negotiating the price of 290 drugs, but over the entire time period, like over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, it could get up to 290. Then we exclude all the drugs where negotiation will not happen. So we negotiate, we leave out any drug that had less than 9 years of sales in the small molecule space, or 13 years in the large molecule space. Or if you had a sole orphan exemption, we take you out. If you're a plasma-derived product, we take you out. So about 75% of the 290 drugs will not have their prices negotiated, even though they cross the 200 million in annual Medicare gross sales. So we're now going to have a sample of 74 drugs, okay? And we're going to ask, if I were to haircut revenues after 9 years for the small molecule drugs, using their actual revenues over this time period, and after 13 years for large molecule drugs, what share of revenues will really come under negotiation? And so this is just one way to highlight what is going to happen in our paper. Let's just focus on the top graph. This is not actual data. This is just to illustrate what we're doing. This is a small molecule drug where, to illustrate, half the sales are US sales and half the sales are global sales. So light blue is the global sale, and then the top half are the US sales. Now, US sales come from 2 sources, Medicare in yellow and commercial in dark blue. So what's happening to this small molecule drug is that in after year 9, the IRA kicks in and we start to negotiate drug prices. And so what we've assumed over here, and we have to assume this at the time we wrote the paper, is we said, what if the government is incredibly aggressive and demands a 50% discount, right? That's what's being illustrated over here. This pharmaceutical company would lose the red area in revenue. That's what they would lose, right? And so you can then discount that money back, because remember, this decision about how much does it impact the incentives for innovation is not being done in year 10, it's being done today. So we're going to assume the industry standard cost of capital of 10.5% and discount that down. And it turns out that in the first panel, this situation, which is a simulated situation, would result in a 5% decrease in the present value of sales, 5%, in this example, okay? So let's see what happens if you do this for other drugs and other companies. So here it is for companies. So AbbVie in this counterfactual world would have lost about $8 billion. BMS would have, I'm sorry, let me back up. They wouldn't lose $8 billion. $8 billion of their revenue could be negotiated. $8 billion of revenue would be the revenue that CMS could say is revenue we would like to negotiate with you. For BMS, it's another $8 billion. And then there's a bunch of companies where on average, if you just use your eyes, it's about $1 billion, right? So if you look at AbbVie is 8, BMS is 8, Pfizer is 4, so that's 8 plus 8 plus 4, that's about 20 billion. And then if you get like another 10 companies with 1 billion, you're going to be up to about $30 billion of lost revenue just from the largest companies. There'll be a bunch of other companies that are not on my chart. So the number is going to be a little bit larger than $30 billion. And here's what that number is. So to put it into perspective, if the industry has about $1 trillion in global sales, let's just think about 3 pieces of those global sales. The first is the dark blue. This is revenue that's not subject to negotiation from firms with affected drugs. So the firm was affected by negotiation, but a ton of its revenue was not. Why? Because it was global revenue or it was commercial revenue. Then there is the $393 billion, which is revenue from firms with no drugs subject to Medicare regulation. So they might be selling to Medicare, but they might be selling less than $200 billion a year. And then there's the yellow-orange piece of about $53 billion. Now, again, just to be very clear, what are we saying with the $43 billion? We're not saying that the IRA will remove $43 billion of sales in present value terms. We're saying $43 billion of sales could be negotiated. So maybe CMS could have come along and said, hey, we're super aggressive. We're paying $43 billion right now, but we want a 50% discount on that. So now you would lose half of the 43. Do you see what I'm saying? And if you lost half of the 43, you would lose $21.6 billion, and that would be a 2% reduction to the top line for the industry. Suppose it was a 75% cut. This is, by the way, these numbers are much, much, much bigger than the actual numbers we saw from CMS. Then that would be a 3% hit to the present value of revenues in this counterfactual world. So that's where we are. We also do this for the top 250 branded drugs by US net sales. Our worry was that a lot of the innovation in this industry comes from revenue that was generated by a handful of drugs. So we're looking at the top 250 drugs. What's interesting about these top 250 drugs is something like 104 of them would not have their prices negotiated by Medicare. And why? The reason is they don't meet that $200 million of sales to Medicare criteria in terms of gross sales. So even in terms of gross sales, they could not have their price negotiated right now. There's another 96 drugs that are top selling where there's 96 drugs where they don't meet the Medicare spending cutoff. Then there's 104 where they do meet the spending cutoff, but they would not have their prices negotiated because of sole orphan and a bunch of other conditions. And then you have the drug negotiation affecting about 50 top selling drugs over this time period. Okay. I think one follow-on to this that we did is, what's been happening in the VC community. So notice if you look at life sciences funding from VCs, it fell dramatically when the IRA was introduced around 2022, and then it fell subsequently in 2023. Now, what you can do is you can actually look in these data at where the funding fell. And so you can see that on the second panel. What you can see is that the funding fell not only for biopharma, small and large molecule, but it also fell for non-biopharma healthcare, right? So non-biopharma healthcare is things like devices. It's things like apps. It's like the Oura Ring and things like that, right? It's like that funding fell too. And then you can look at funding that is sort of outside of healthcare. So like a VC company investing in a scooter company or something like that. That fell as much, and I don't think that the scooter companies were being affected by the IRA. So I'm not 100% sure that the fall that we saw was the consequence of the IRA. You can also do this a variety of other ways. Biopharma's share of total venture capital funding, didn't fall dramatically. Like if you thought the IRA just, takes a huge bite out of the incentives to innovate, we certainly didn't see that in the actual decisions that VCs made. The trends for early and late stage biopharma investments, they both fall about proportionally. And then finally, if the IRA had really reduced the present value of a project that a venture capitalist was investing in, then basic finance would say that the post-money valuation would have fallen considerably. And the post-money valuation after the IRA passes in 2022 is essentially the same. It has stayed. So if you thought there was going to be this big hit to the value of the project, then we've certainly not seen that. So I'm going to stop over there and take your questions. How am I doing on time, Ben? Okay, great. In that case, no.
Is this on? Oh, beautiful. So what we're going to do is raise questions if you have, or raise your hand if you have questions, ask away. If you're online, I believe we have an email address that you can send those questions to that will be relayed to us in person, and hopefully we'll be able to ask it. But maybe let's start in person. I actually have a question if people want to take a second. So looking forward, I have a big question that sticks out to me is that we are in the middle of one of our very few opportunities to really ask these kinds of questions about how investors are going to respond. We are also in the middle of a very uncertain world with lots of headwinds, some general macroeconomic trade wars, things of that nature, kind of sticky inflation. We have things that are specific to healthcare. We have maybe the international reference pricing is going to make a reappearance. We have uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty about what's going to happen with overseeing of the various programs. Do you worry at all moving forward about being able to actually distill the IRA effect amidst all of that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. And I do for two reasons. The first is that some of the forces that you described are far more consequential than the IRA. For the simple reason, basic finance, right? If you think about an investor's decision to invest in a project, what are they thinking about? They're thinking about the cost of the project. What's the R&D cost? They're thinking about the future revenues. And then they have to discount those future revenues back. That's basically, at its core, what's going on. Now, the discount rate that you use, the cost of capital, has just gone up tremendously, right? It's gone up tremendously. Why has it gone up? First, it's gone up because anytime you have inflation, it's going to go up. And we've just created a ton of inflation. We've created that inflation. So the risk-free rate is going to go up. For every sector in the economy, investment will fall, right? Number one. The discount rate between risky bonds and less risky bonds is going to go up. Investors in the bond market will demand an additional premium to lend to risky projects. In equity markets, what matters is the equity premium, the gap between what the S&P returns or NASDAQ returns and the risk-free rate. that is going to go up dramatically. So putting aside pharma, like, you could be a steel company, a car company, a scooter company, a pharma company, like there is going to be dramatically less investment, right? And the size of that effect is going to swamp the effect of any policy that is sort of, on the other hand, trying to tinker with 1 or 2% of revenues, right? So those IRA effects could be consequential, just to be clear, but I think they're going to be small relative to all the other factors that you mentioned. I just want to come back to one thing, which is, I will say, first, I'm not modeling the Part D redesign, and I really don't have a sense of the magnitude of that. So maybe that's very big, and I'm just ignoring that. The other thing I'll say is, I am living in a world, as I stand in front of you, assuming that investors are actually experts in finance, and they do the discounted cash flow calculation the way I did it for you. But suppose they're not. Right? Suppose they're like, oh my gosh, 9 and 13, I got to stop investment today. All right, they're the investor. I'm just the professor. They'll stop the investment today, right? But then what that also means is that they would have actually passed up on valuable projects. But nevertheless, it is possible that if they're not doing the DCF model the way the more analytical investors are doing it, it is possible that if investors are reactive, that the IRA could actually have incredibly damaging effects. And that's a statement about investor sentiment, and I'm not an expert on that. Alice?
Yeah, so actually following up on that point, I wondered, and I thought this was really interesting, I think taking a look at the impact on global revenues and what share of the revenues will actually be impacted. I wonder if you have thoughts on the types of drugs that will be impacted, because I think if you start to dig into a little bit more of the heterogeneity across drug classes and drug types, I think one of the things in the IRA that stands out to me is the fact that it's the high revenue drugs that are going to be targeted more so than the low revenue drugs. Do you think even if on a global scale there isn't a change in the number of drugs that will be affected, like total new innovation, I'm saying, do you think there's going to be a change in the composition of innovation?
I mean, for sure, there could, so theoretically, there ought to be a shift in the composition. I mean, even in our analysis, we are seeing revenue losses. Revenue losses mean fewer drugs. The degree to which a revenue loss affects the incentives to innovate depends on just that very simple present value calculation. So assume that I'm an investor and I'm making a Series A investment today. And I know my Series A investment will take about 6 years to become a drug. I'm a really good investor. So it takes only 6 years from my Series A to get the drug into patients. So I'm being super aggressive about the world. 6 years. And now this drug is going to sell, it's a small molecule drug, for 9 years before the IRA comes along. So when is the IRA haircut going to happen? The IRA haircut is going to happen 15 years from now. And for the large molecule biologic, it's going to happen 18 years from now. Let's just kind of do the math on that. Suppose this is going to be an awesome small molecule drug. Awesome, to your point about great drugs. And so say 15 years from now, basically I would have gotten a terminal value of $100 billion. Freaking amazing drug. So I get $100 billion if I'm successful, but I'm making that decision today. I'm looking at a cost of capital of about 12%, but let's just be really aggressive and say it's only 10%. That $100 billion 15 years from now, in an industry which is incredibly risky, so the probability of getting that $100 billion is only 5%, discounted at 10%, today, the present value of that is about $700 million. There's just no way that like haircutting something 15 years out by 10 or 20 or 30% ought to be making huge differences in the portfolio right now. There's just no way. Now, it's completely different if you hit the launch price. It's completely different if you start to negotiate prices at launch or at year 5. Then the math really, really, really starts to change. But right now, it's just a present value discounting rate problem. The revenues are so far out. This industry's clock speed is so slow That's not a criticism. That's just the reality of science and drug development. It's so uncertain. The cash flows are so uncertain. And the discount rates are so high. I was using 10% for my illustration. They're probably like 12, 13, 14, 15%. There's just no way that doing something 15, 20 years out should be first order today. Yeah. Now again, but to your point, Alice, it goes back to investor sentiment. It could be perceived. It could be that investors don't do the present value calculation, and then it's going to seem really, really big to them.
So I'm going to follow up on that question.
Can you wait for just the folks online here?
Thank you. This is Ann Anderson Cook at Arnold Ventures about the present discount value calculation. But it would be the case like venture capitalists would know to do that calculation. Or I'm just asking, because I'm in your boat of being an economist. I didn't go to business school. But I would think a lot of the people making these decisions would use an internal rate of return model or something like that,
Yeah.
or they would be taking this into account.
I mean, there should be, and at least in this chart over here on the left, this is actual data. This is not simulated data. This is data about the actual decisions made by venture capitalists in the biopharma space. Yes, they cut back their investments. Yes, they cut back pretty dramatically between 21 and 22. They did. But so did other investors who are investing in other things like scooters, which makes me think that the decline in biopharma investment between 21 and 22 is mostly about the increase in the interest rate, because once you raise the interest rate, you raise the cost of capital. Once you raise the cost of capital, the NPV of all the projects falls. That's what's happening here. This is the increase in the interest rate, which I think is, back to Ben's question, far more consequential than the current incarnation of the IRA. So there are other versions of the IRA that could, again, I'm not saying IRA is great. I'm just saying, look, you could do deadly things with the IRA, which would be terrible for the industry. The current version, even at scale, so you're negotiating the prices of many, many drugs. From a finance point of view, I would still bet on the industry. I would not in any way, my faith in the industry and its ability to innovate is not diminished. Yes?
Did you, Lawrence Helmschen, GW, did you include any spillovers on commercial insurers in your projections?
That's a great point.
I have two more questions.
So
if I may. What about the adjustment that the pharma companies may make, right? That you give them a 9-year horizon, so will they raise prices much faster than they otherwise would, or will they how will they prepare themselves for that haircut that they can foresee? And then the last question, would why not give them the haircut right now, right? So then you get the price effect without the innovation effect and say, okay, we slash your revenue right now, and then a couple years from now, we'll let you price whatever you want.
So personally, I don't like creating additional uncertainty for an industry that already has to do things over 20 and 30 years at a very high cost of capital with tremendous uncertainty. This is an industry that relies on science coming out of the NIH. So we've sort of taken a bat to this industry in multiple ways. Now we've put tariffs on drugs that are manufactured in Ireland. So this is pretty challenging. So the last thing I want to do is, I'm going to take a piece of your current revenue, but promise to give it back in some future year. I just think our ability to be credible with consequential institutions like the NIH is so poor that I think with the pharma thing, I would be very personally, but I'm just a professor, I'm not a politician, I would be very, very worried about that. You asked the first question about what did we assume about commercial prices. So in this analysis, we assumed nothing, that these are separate markets. I think theory would tell us that if Medicare prices fell, commercial prices would also fall. That's so in other words, the effect of cutting revenue in Medicare, there's an additional savings, if you will, depending on which side of this issue you are, revenue loss if you're a pharmaceutical company, which is one reason that we talked about some very aggressive discounts. Remember I said, what if CMS demanded a 50% discount? What if they demanded a 75% discount? In part just to illustrate a world where it's sort of a simple way of dealing with a spillover onto commercial. Yeah. So we, just to be clear, but we didn't model that second part. And was there a question in the middle that I just skipped over?
Will they change their pricing strategies,
I think
before
that
they hit
answer
that
is
cliff?
that is such a great question. I think that if we had 50 pharma CEOs in the room, we might get 50 different answers from them. Because it really depends, in my view, Lawrence, it really depends on whether you could raise price, right? And if you could raise price, why didn't you raise price even before the IRA, right? So now there are companies that maybe could have raised price, but like when I'm teaching finance, I'm not starting with a model of a for-profit company being able to raise price and not raising price, right? Like that's not, as an economist, that's like a weird model. The industry will really have it coming to it if it starts to claim that it could have raised price and didn't, because this actually means I think then the regulator could say, go ahead and just raise price, right? So in a weird way, this is not a good thing to be saying that you could have raised price and you didn't. Your investors are going to be very unhappy because you're on an earnings call. I don't think the CEOs of any of the companies I listed would be like, we could have raised price even more, but we chose not to. I don't think that resonates with your investors. And secondly, I think it does resonate really well with the regulator, because the regulator will say, great, it's not so damaging after all. Why don't you just go ahead and raise price? So I think we should, if we're profit maximizing, we should stay profit maximizing.
All right, I think we're going to cut off questions there. Help me thank Amitabh for his presentation. I would be remiss if I did not point out excellent work by a speaker planting questions about the topic of their talk they're about to give. Professor Alice Chen now is going to give us a presentation about the issue of the composition of drugs that come to market and how these kinds of policies can fundamentally reshape that. So please join me in welcoming Professor Chen.
All right. There is no green button. I can see why you were confused. There is a green button. That's called the front, not the back. Okay. Thank you for having me. We'll be talking to you of work in progress, actually, with two of my co-authors, Partha Deb and Darius Lakdawala. And I think what motivated us to look at this paper really was the fact that I think we have a lot of ongoing debate on what are the long-term implications of drug price controls, broadly speaking. I have just an article here and there talking about the potential implications of the IRA, but in just terms of the discussions that we've been seeing and hearing, the debate is always about, are there going to be fewer drugs? How many fewer drugs, if there are going to be fewer drugs? Of the drugs that are potentially fewer, do we care or do we not? And what actually really motivated us to work on this was the question that we were interested in trying to figure out is it going to affect the incentives to pursue riskier drugs, and will innovators will they be less willing to take risk, essentially? Okay, so I thought I would start by just kind of giving you a lay of the land. There has been a lot of work done in this space on trying to figure out what is the impact of market revenues on innovation. What I'm showing you here is the different types of elasticities that have been estimated. In other words, the responsiveness of innovation to changes in revenue. And you can see that there's a cluster of estimates here between 0 and 1, and these estimates suggest that a 10% reduction in expected revenues will lead to anywhere from a 2.5% to a 15% decline in innovation. We also have some estimates that are much further out on the spectrum, so things saying that the responsiveness of innovation to revenues is much higher, something on the order of 2.8 or even 4 to 6. Okay. And you might ask, well, like if everyone's studying the same question, why are we getting a whole bunch of different answers? And it really comes down to how people are modeling the empirical framework that they're using and applying in order to get these estimates. One of the things I would note is that cross-sectional analyses or aggregate time series analyses, I think, are very challenging at trying to understand the picture, mostly because there's so many differences and changes over time, things like technological innovations and improvements in certain drug classes and not other drug classes, and it affects our ability to kind of understand the responsiveness of innovation. Panel data, we're looking at the impact on a drug class over time, or structural models, which I know my co-panelist Chris Adams will be talking about, I think are much better sort of approaches in trying to understand this question. And I think some of the other things that affect differences in the estimates that we're seeing just come from the fact that people are using different assumptions, whether they're looking at short-run effects or long-run effects, whether they're imputing data or not, whether you're thinking about US revenues or global revenues. How big is your price change will impact how big of a response in innovation you'll see, and many other factors and sort of assumptions on drug development costs are being done. And so this is all underlying many of the estimates that you see in the literature. And so what we do is something that it takes an approach that some of the others in the literature have also done, is to essentially leverage Medicare Part D in trying to answer some of the questions on the relationship between revenues and types of drugs. Okay, so this observation is essentially just saying that Medicare Part D affected different drug classes more than others, in particular affected drug classes with larger shares of elderly populations. Each circle you see here is a drug class, and you can see as the percent of Medicare enrollees in that drug class is increasing, you can see a bigger change on expected revenues from Part D. Right. The IRA, I will point out, runs obviously this experiment in reverse. The IRA is targeting drugs with higher Medicare revenues, and so it's the opposite of what we're seeing here. And something that we know is that essentially Part D increased revenues by a lot, by 47%. We don't have anything to say on what the IRA does in terms of revenues, and that's why I found Amitabh's presentation to be really interesting. So, if you take, for example, that Part D increased revenues by 47%, what we find is that new drugs approved will increase by 12.7%, which translates really to 58 new drugs over 10 years, right? If you run this experiment in reverse and you take hypothetically that the IRA decreased revenues by 10%, the translation in our estimates would say that new drugs approved will fall by 2.7%, or over a 10-year period, that's 12 fewer new drugs. Okay. And all I'm showing you in this graph is just the differential change of Part D on the new drugs approved. So what it's saying is the drug classes with very little Medicare penetration that were not affected as much by Part D did not really see a change in the number of drugs approved, but in the drug classes that had a much larger impact from Medicare, you do see that change in number of new approvals. Okay. I will say that our estimates are pretty similar to some of the ones that I showed you early on towards the lower end of the spectrum. So we find an elasticity of about 0.26, which translates to essentially a 10% increase in revenues will lead to 2.7 more approvals, 2.66, hence 2.7. And so that's what we're finding, right? So essentially Part D increased the number of phase 1 trials pursued, the number of phase 2 trials pursued, number of phase 3 trials pursued, and ultimately the number of approvals. And so, this, is just another estimate that's in the literature that kind of shows you, yes, there is an increase in innovation as a result of increased R&D, increased revenues. And the thing that we're really interested in is, did that actually affect the types of drugs that were pursued? And so we looked at the failure rates. And what we're showing you here is what happened to the number of drugs that failed from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, phase 3 to approval, and eventually phase 1 to approval, that entire pipeline. And what we find in the paper is essentially a 10% increase in revenues led to 1.5% more phase 1 trials that failed to get to approval. Okay. So in other words, we're seeing more phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 and approvals, right, as a result of Part D, and we're also seeing more failures. Okay. And the question is like, well, if you put them together, is the failure rate going up? And we do actually see that the failure rate did increase. So what's happening here is if you look at the drugs that were pursued prior to Part D, drugs were failing on average at 92%. Okay, and you can see that phase 1 to approval at the very end there in the gray bar. The orange bar is looking at the failure rates of drugs that were induced to be explored as a result of the Part D increase in revenues. And what you can see here is that the drugs that were spawned by Part D, those new candidates that were explored, they were failing at much higher rates, failing at 98%. Okay. And so we take this to conclude that essentially what was happening as a result of Part D was firms were taking on greater risk because the drugs were failing at higher rates, the R&D costs were going up, and the way we translate that is by looking at the number of phase 1 trials that are needed to develop one drug. And the same thing you can see, and this is actually just raw data in and of itself, you can see that in drug classes where there was low Medicare market share, there wasn't much change in the number of new phase 1 trials needed to develop one drug. But in classes where there were large Medicare market share, you see this large increase in the number of phase 1 trials that are needed to get one drug out. Okay, and that just aligns with the previous result that is telling you that failure rates of new drugs introduced by Part D were increasing. Okay. You can then translate this into changes in R&D costs, and really what we do is we take the failure rates that we see, we translate those into the number of phase 1 trials, 2 trials, and phase 3 trials needed to get one drug. And you can see here that the numbers are very different, and the reason is because if you have a drug that fails at 90%, what that means is a 10% of success. So 1 of 10 drugs will make it to market, right? If the failure rate's 95%, that means the success rate's 5%. So 1 in 20 drugs make it to market, right? So when there's a small change in failure rates, especially because the failure rates are so high, it translates to a much larger need for phase 1, 2, and 3 trials in order to make one drug out to market. Okay. So you can apply your favorite cost estimate that you want. I've only shown one here. There are a lot of different estimates on the cost of the sort of the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials that are out there. But the bottom line is that the R&D cost will increase simply driven by the fact that more drugs are failing. Okay. Then we wanted to ask, well, fine. Okay, so manufacturers are getting more drugs out, they're failing at higher rates. What does that mean for the quality of drugs that we see? And this, I think, has been a really challenging question to answer because quality is difficult to measure. And if you use, for example, CEA estimates, the challenge with that is like there's differences in modeling assumptions, there's differences in the types of data that we see because not all drugs have CEA estimates on it, so it's a pretty selected sample of drugs that do have information. And so we rely on the French HTA body, their Haas authority that essentially evaluates clinical impact of all drugs in France. And the reason we do that, and this has actually been done in a couple other studies in the literature, is because they have a pretty uniform way of measuring clinical benefit. All drugs in France, if you want to be reimbursed, have to be evaluated by Haas, and essentially what happens there is they do a literature review, they take the RCT estimates, they do meta-analyses, filings from the pharmaceutical companies, and they make an assessment on the value, or actually the additional value of that drug to the market as determined by a committee of physicians, pharmacists, and methodologists. Okay. And to give you a sense of what this really looks like, they essentially use a 5-point scaling system to measure clinical benefit, really should be additive clinical benefit. The first category is drugs that have major improvements, make major clinical improvements, and it ranges all the way to the bottom of drugs that have no improvement. Okay, and to give you, I just listed some examples here to kind of give you a sense of what types of drugs are in categories 1 versus 5. You can see in 1, you've got some cancer drugs, you've got statins in there, and then in 5, you've got I think it's actually an antihistamine drug in there, so it's an allergy drug. Okay. In France, if your drug is rated in categories 1 through 3, so major, significant, or moderate, what happens is you get expedited market access and more favorable pricing. Drugs in category 5 essentially are reimbursed only if their cost is lower than the competitor on the market. Okay, so we essentially use this rating scale and look at of the drugs that came out pre-Part D versus post-Part D, do we see a shift in the change of drugs in each of these categories? We lump 1 through 3 together just to get a little bit more power. So these are major, significant, and moderate drugs versus minor drugs or no improvement drugs. Okay. And this is what we find. So the blue bars are telling you the distribution of drugs in each of these categories pre-Part D. The orange bars are telling you the distribution of drugs that, the distribution of quality across the new drugs that were spawned as a result of Part D. And you can see a change in the distribution in quality. So pre-Part D, you had a, like a 23.9% likelihood of being in the major to moderate improvement category. Post-Part D, that's 35.5%. It also reduced the probability of no improvement drugs, as you can see in the last bucket here, by 14.4 percentage points. Okay. Now, what does this mean for the IRA? It really depends on many things. I mean, it depends on whether or not you think the responsiveness to a revenue increase is the same as a responsiveness to a revenue cut. What we're doing is saying, look, we don't really know how much the IRA impacts revenues. Now I think we can take Amitabh's numbers. But CBO reported revenue reduction of 1 to 3%. Phillips and Dury reported a revenue reduction of 19%. If it is 19%, we will have 70 fewer drugs. If it is this 1 to 3% number that you see from the CBO, we will have anywhere from 3.7 to 11 fewer drugs over the next 30 years. Is a really long time period that we're looking at. That middle line is just what is the 10% hypothetical number, right? If you didn't have, if you had 10% revenue reductions, we would have 37 fewer drugs. And then if you apply the changes in the distribution of quality that we see, we just took the counterfactual that we got from that Phillips and Dury paper how do I go back? This one. So we essentially said, okay, let's just take that 70 fewer drug number. How many of those drugs will be high quality drugs? And if you apply the percent distribution that we saw from Part D, we're finding that of those 70 drugs, 25 of them are major, significant, or moderate. 43 of them are minor clinical value. We could apply this, to any sort of change in the number of drugs. This is just the one that we chose to do. And essentially, so what we're finding is that 25 of the foregone drugs will be clinically impactful drugs. Okay, and this is the hypothetical of if we had revenues falling by 19%. So that just kind of gives you a summary of where we're at, and be happy to take questions.
I mean, one of the things that this does seem like it highlights, following Amitabh's talk, is in some ways how difficult it is to take the Part D, the introduction of Part D is like the cornerstone of all of the estimates we have for this literature. But it is a huge change in revenue compared to, Amitabh saying, maybe a couple percentage points. Even if you take seriously the point that he emphasized, that maybe some of these investors really are not, they're not scoring the bill as written like CBO is. They're actually inferring that this thing is going to get expanded down the road and it's going to be a bigger hit than it looks. But even if that's true, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 10% compared to almost 50%. I guess my question is, are these estimates, are we confident that these estimates actually extrapolate to the IRA setting, which is a more nuanced, unpredictable, but nuanced setting?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think one of the things that we do is we use the Part D experiment, and there's another paper in the literature that does not use the Part D experiment. They're looking at global revenues and essentially changes in population demographics over time, just general changes. And this is the paper by Dubois and his co-authors. And our elasticity estimates are very close to his. So we find an elasticity estimate of 0.27. His, I think, is a 0.23 or 0.24, around there. So those estimates do apply. I can't say that the quality estimates are going to be the same, but at least in terms of changes in the number of new drugs, that should be pretty consistent.
The market expansion under Part D changed like current revenues in a given year by a certain amount, but different interventions in the market change revenues in different ways, and the negotiations happen later in a drug's product life, so that's a little bit different. There's just different ways that revenues get changed, and is there anything you can say about that, about how that might impact how you think about things?
Yeah, so what we're looking at is the change in expected net expected net profits of essentially over a 10-year period. And so if there is a cut in revenues, we're expecting, that change or an increase in our case, really, to to flow through a 10-year period, thinking that there's going to be generic entry. In Dubois' paper, in case it helps with the framing, he has a 20-year period, kind of thinking about the change in revenue life cycle over a 20-year period. So, surely, I don't know for sure what are going to be the impacts if you have shorter impacts or different impacts on different time points in the drug life cycle, but I can say that the things that we did find are based on sort of a 10-year expected impact for revenues of the average drug in a drug class. Yeah.
Can you actually help explain the theory behind these results? As I understand it, it's Part D comes into effect. It kind of seems like suddenly firms have some risky bets, and now they're willing to kind of take them where they didn't used to be. And is it that they happen to be high quality, or is it something else?
Yeah, so a priori, we actually have a theory model in the paper, which I didn't present, and the model, the model essentially is basic economics, and essentially has this observation that if demand expands and supply curves slope up, and for those of you who are economics nerds in the audience, your demand curve slope down, supply curve slope up. If your demand curve expands, what happens is quantity increase and prices go up, right? So if you think about that in the sense of how much innovation will you see, you'll see more innovation. What does that mean for the price or the cost? It goes up, right? And so a lot of this idea that firms are going to try riskier drugs that are going to cost more in terms of the R&D actually can just simply be explained by demand expanding over time, regardless of Part D or not, right? And so that's what we're kind of showing in the paper. We don't have a great model yet, I would say. I'm not sure we're going to get there on what does that mean for quality of drugs. I think that's an empirical question of whether the drugs that are riskier are also the ones that are of higher quality, and that's what we happen to find. It doesn't have to be that way.
Other questions?
There's this work by Craig Garthwaite and Manuel, and they argue that Part D sort of had differential effects on sort of innovative drugs. So how does your work sort of line up with their work? Can you explain what their theory is? I'm gonna let Alice explain.
I'm happy to take that one on. Yes. So, there's a couple different papers out there trying to get at different measures of kind of quality, broadly speaking, I would say. The one that we have taken on in this paper is looking at the Haas estimates, which measure clinical benefit. And it lines up with another paper that's out there that essentially looks at what happens to firm-specific investments on quality. They're also using Haas, and this is a paper by Josh Krieger and his co-authors, and Josh is at HBS. And essentially what they find is similar to ours in that when firms have an influx of cash, they will take on a higher quality sort of drugs. Ours is slightly different in that we're not looking at firm-specific investments. But to get to your point about this paper by Craig Garthwaite and his co-authors, what they're looking at in terms of their measure of quality is actually a measure that they call novelty, which is based on whether or not there's different target-based action investments. And I don't know how the Haas quality scores match up with the target-based action, right? They're very different, right? Questions in some sense. One is is your mechanism of action different versus whether the quality is different? There's some details in why our sort of our paper looks a little bit different than theirs as well. And in particular, one of the things that we're doing is our drug cohorts we're focused on is between 2006 and 2012, and that's really because Part D came into effect in 2006. So we look at what happens to the new drugs that are being developed over this sort of 6-year time frame and follow those drugs over time. Their panel is actually much longer, and a lot of their effects that they're finding is post-2012.
I had a question about the Haas estimates. Are they static, like at launch, and can they evolve over time? Because it seems like there's other drugs coming on the market, things that were beneficial are now just marginal improvements, but that's leading to competition. And like that might be an interesting margin, like how they evolve over time when new drugs come on the market.
Yeah, so that's also a really good question. If I have the French regulation down correctly, they have to get reevaluated every 3 to 5 years. I forget if it's 3 or 5, but like periodically they have to get reevaluated, and so it does change over time. Yeah.
I wonder if we can turn the logic around. So if we don't observe any dip in investment in new and higher quality drugs, does that imply anything about the probability that the investors put on the longevity of the IRA? Because there might be a different administration. Can it be repealed? Right? It's still 9 years out. So how much is it set in stone? How much can be? I know, and it's difficult to take away an entitlement like Part D, but this 9-year span is a lot less visible than the benefit, an entitlement that you give people today.
Yeah, I don't know.
It's unfair because
I don't know if we have a good answer for that. Yeah.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Alice, not only for the talk, but for being ahead of schedule. This is unbelievable. We're going to take a quick break, grab coffee, and then we'll be back, and Chris will present the new, not totally new version of the old model. So thanks. See you all in a few. All right. I think we are going to get this restarted with our last presentation. Chris Adams is going to present from the CBO, although presumably not on behalf of the CBO. He can give you the disclaimer. The slides went through 45 rounds of review, but they are his personal opinions only, I'm sure. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Chris Adams to talk about the way CBO is modeling this trade-off. Green button.
Oh, it's quite big. Okay, I've got my hot cross bun recipe here. No, that's okay. Talk recipe. Thank you, thank you, Ben, for doing this, putting this on, and how you set it up too. Having Amitabh and Alice set up the talk, it makes it a lot easier for me. So, as Ben said, this is a newish model. We have in the title ongoing updates. So that's meant to get at sort of two things. We've been continually updating how we're thinking about this problem back to when I started with Rebecca and Anna at CBO back in 2019. Initially, our estimates were based on the literature. Alice teed up. We got some pushback because there's such wide estimates. And we started, basically I was asked, well, let's think about modeling this internally and, let's build a model just for our internal purposes, and how can we think about this problem, and then that will let us sort of think and talk about what we see in the literature. And I think, one of the things we saw when we did that was this huge time, how much time it takes to get drugs to market that you don't really get a sense of with the elasticity estimates. And so with that, we started spending more time, more work on developing the model. We used the model to some extent in scoring what was called HR3. So this was a proposal by the House Democrats to allow Secretary of HHS to negotiate drug prices not only for Medicare programs, but also for the commercial market. And at launch, we then wrote a working paper. That working paper was published in, I think, August of 2021. We got feedback. As we do things like this, as we do working papers, we get feedback. We get feedback from staff on the Hill. We get feedback from members of Congress. We get feedback from think tanks. We get feedback from academic experts. We get feedback from industry experts. And we get feedback in all sorts of different ways, from comments from presentations like this, to tweets, to people coming in talking to us directly. We also get feedback from patient advocates, sort of a wide group of people. And as we get that feedback, we make adjustments and changes to our modeling. So in the winter of 2022, we presented a slide deck on changes we made to the model. And that model is sort of the current thing we're using and what we use for the IRA. Now we're thinking of another change to the model, an update to the model, and we're thinking about two things that are going to change. One is we're going to use much more granular data. So we're sort of moving from thinking about aggregate things to using much more granular data, and that's going to allow us a model that can we can think about how a policy can affect different drugs differently. And so we saw that in the IRA with small and large molecules. We see it now in baseline with how cancer drugs are treated differently through approval than rheumatoid arthritis drugs. So we want a model that would sort of naturally allow us to think about those differences. The other thing is a lot more technical, just thinking about the decision problem. So Amitabh and Alice sort of both talked a little bit about the decision problem for the firms. We made some very simple assumptions, simplifying assumptions in our model, which allowed us to get going and produce results, but had a concern that maybe these are not general enough. And so we're making changes to that, but that's pretty technical, and Ben doesn't want me to talk about it. So what are we talking about? This is the innovative process for drugs. It's a very regimented and regulated process. We want to model different parts of this process and think about different policies, how different policies will affect this process. So we've traditionally been concentrating on, how would revenue changes lead to changes in the incentives to develop the drugs, but we could see other changes as well. What would a 10% reduction in NIH funding do to the number of new drugs that come to market? What would a 20% reduction in staffing at FDA do to the number of drugs coming to market? We know from Thomas Phillipson's work that changes in FDA staffing have measurable effects on how long it takes to get through the regulatory process, and so if we see such changes, leading to increases in the time in the regulatory process, time is money, increases in costs, maybe fewer drugs coming to market. So we want a model that's going to be able to answer a bunch of those questions. If you look at the sort of the burnt orange Texas Longhorn sort of colors there, that's the basic science. That's the science that's funded by NIH R1 grants. people doing basic research, and to some extent that's outside of our modeling. So, the science and that NIH funding changes, what happens, but we're not going to model that explicitly. Then you have that brown area, and in our model, we're going to think about you having an actual drug candidate. So there's a firm, and we're thinking about firms making decisions. So here we have firms making decisions about bringing an actual drug candidate to market and doing their pre-clinical testing. So they might go and test on animal models, which are, actual animals, and test to see if this drug candidate is going to have the sort of effect that they think it might on a particular disease. This part of the process is also heavily funded by NIH, but we also see a lot of venture funding here. We've had this part of the process in our model for a while. We're not going to, in our update, we're not going to change how we're thinking about this part of the process. So all the parameters and stuff are going to stay the same. Now, that could be something like in the future that we look at changing as, as people have ideas, as we do more work, where we might make some changes there. Once the drug candidate has a bunch of these tests done, then they go to the FDA and do an IND application, and that will allow them to go into human clinical trials. So again, we're not going to model the FDA, but changes to FDA staffing could affect that part of the process, the development process. And we do want to be able to model that part of that type of policy. Then we get to, I'm going to say, aqua area. Aqua is really where the heart of our model is. So we're thinking about a firm thinking about these questions, like how do I take a drug through each of these 3 phases of development? And I'm going to have 3 decision points. So we're going to model these 3 decision points. Going into phase 1 trials, these are the small safety trials, less expensive. Then I go into phase 2 trial. These are somewhat bigger, some efficacy, some safety. And then I have my big phase 3 efficacy trials that I'm going to take to the FDA to get marketing approval. This part of the process is heavily funded by the industry. In this data, in this 2022 data, we see the BARDA up there, which is a government agency. That was mostly COVID funding and sort of relatively temporary. So, we're thinking about industry taking drugs through this process, and we want to model this process. Once they get their whole package together, they go back to the FDA. The FDA review, maybe 6 months, 2 years, and then if it gets approved, then it goes on to market. And the government is there as one of the major payers, and so policy that the government changes to policy like the IRA, like HR 3 back in 2019, could affect that whole downstream process. So we want a model that's going to think about what would happen if you had a policy that changed what the payers were going to do, but also a model that will allow us to think about, well, what if you had a change in science or science funding? What would that do? Ben, I lost track of time. What's my timing?
I don't know. We're kind of ahead of schedule.
Thanks, Alice.
I will. I will make one point that I forgot to make, which is that Chris has agreed to more of an academic style question approach.
Oh, yeah, bring it on.
So during the talk and dial up the hostility, if you could, based on the earlier one. So just raise your hand and we can ask as we go.
Well, this is a good place to stop. If are there questions that people would have about, how sort of this sort of general framework and how we're thinking about this type of modeling approach? So, it is quite different from like what Alice has done, and for sort of the literature. There are some simulation models out there in the literature, but this is a little different from sort of using the literature. So we're using a simulation model. And I think Alice sort of hinted at why we're doing that. We're sort of thinking about these very long-term effects that, we might not see. If there's effects on the IRA, we might not see that for many, many, many years. Greg.
Thank you. Greg Daniel from Eli Lilly. You mentioned two general buckets of changes coming, the ones that Ben allowed you to talk about, and then the ones that Ben said not to talk about. So those are the ones I'm interested in. Can
The
you,
second one, sure.
on the technical side, which I think you characterized as sort of decision problems, can you just give us a flavor or some examples, a little color there on that?
Yeah, so let's think about this picture here, and again, we're thinking about this teal, no, aqua. I don't know what the difference between teal and aqua is. Let's go with aqua. This is aqua period. I'm going to ask our graphics people to label the colors.
You do have a laser pointer.
Oh, do I? Wow.
Like a firework.
Firework. Oh, yeah. Well, look at that. Thank you very much. So we're looking at this period. In a current model, we are thinking about it as a dynamic problem. So we're literally trying to model what your firm does. So we are thinking about a dynamic problem, meaning when Eli Lilly has a drug candidate that they're thinking about taking into phase 1, they're thinking through the whole process. They're thinking, well, there's a probability that gets to phase 2, and then there's going to be some expenses there if that happens. Then there's a probability that it gets to phase 3, and then there's going to be large expenses if that happens. And then, hopefully it gets through FDA and takes some period of time, and then finally there's payoff. And so in the current model, we allow the firms to think through this dynamic problem. The simplification we made is that if I get, I'm Eli Lilly, I get some really good feedback from my preclinical, I didn't kill as many mice as I'd originally planned, that, that's really good information that I might take as I'm thinking through, given that, good signal I got about this drug, I think I'm going to do pretty well, going through these phases and going onto market. That doesn't happen in our current model. So if I get that good signal, I then sort of think everything reverts back to average. So even when I get to the next phase, everything's reverting back to the average. So that's probably unrealistic. It's probably too strong of an assumption. So I want to make changes to that assumption. I want to allow the decision maker to think, well, if I get good signal today, I'm probably going to get a good signal in my phase 2 trial, my phase 3, and good on, be good on the market. I'm not going to impose that type of correlation, but I'm going to allow a model that can, where the data can allow that to be the case. That turns out to be hard. We're keeping parts of Northern Virginia warmer at the moment. it takes a while, and it's yeah.
Can I ask since we have this timeline up, I'm reminded of, so one of the things that Amitabh's talk, I think, really emphasized is that the discount rate that you're using early in this picture is really, really important for how you think about this process.
Right.
As the world changes, does the model sort of know that? Do you say, well, today is a more uncertain world with more policy uncertainty down the road, or whatever it might be, and so you change the that type of discount rate, or is that something you just sort of abstract from?
So, short answer, no. Not currently in the model. I think the approach that we've used to date has been to take Damodaran's work. When you work at a place like CBO, you have experts on lots of different stuff, and so we have experts on like financing, and they like our internal CBO experts like the Damodaran estimates, and so we take the pharmaceutical and biotech average cost of capital from those estimates, and then we've been using those. Amitabh, I think he's suggesting that maybe we should relook, at least update those numbers. But I think we'll probably, unless somebody sort of convinces my colleague, not me, convinces my colleague that we shouldn't be using Damodaran's numbers, I think we'll continue to do that. And that, those numbers, I think there's a argument. Again, I'm not an expert. I don't teach finance at Harvard, so I don't know, what the best argument is for, okay, we're going to more uncertain future because of tariffs, because of all these other things. So that was my short answer, no. My long answer was sort of long-winded. So the bit I am allowed to talk about is that we're going to use new data. So we have a couple of, now I have the laser point. We have a couple of columns. So this is the data and what we were doing in the previous version of the model, and this is the data that we're using in this version of the model. And the basic idea is to allow us to be more flexible. So, when we were looking at policies that we're going to treat biologicals differently from chemicals, or looking at policies that may affect accelerated approval, we wanted to, we did model that in our current model, but it's a bit of a square peg trying to fit into a round hole. We're hoping that with this data, by having much more granular data, we can get different estimates for different types of drugs, and allow a better estimate for how each policy may affect those drugs differently. We're using SSR Health data, so this gives us pretty good estimates of drug companies' revenue for the US. We don't have great information on rest of the world. Colleen, we had a big discussion at an event in Boston in November about this question. Amitabh pointed out that some of these big US drugs are really important in sort of funding and incentivizing development. So this is a sort of question we're thinking about, is how do we think about rest of the world revenue, given that we have data is coming from the US. We're using this WUDAS data set. The nice thing about the WUDAS data set is it gives us expenditures on drugs for individual drugs. So we're able to go in and say, is this a cancer drug or is this a biological? So we're able to get different estimates for different types of drugs using that data. And then we're using the Cortalis data and NIH's clinicaltrials.gov. Again, we have very detailed information about the drugs, particularly from the Cortalis data. So we can look at how success probabilities and entry decisions are different for different types of drugs.
Hi, this is Colleen Carey from Cornell, and I had a quick question. You say drug level success rates, but I think one of the conclusions from Alice's work is that maybe it's not a binary 1-0. There's a bunch of data that comes out of each phase, and the firm has to make a binary go, no go decision, but it's so maybe when we say success rate, you mean did they proceed, which is a perfectly reasonable way to define success rate. But I guess I'm interested in, like that margin, the go, no go margin for a fixed set of information.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So traditionally in this area, we've sort of thought about what I would call transition probabilities. What's the probability of moving a drug from phase 1 to phase 2? In this work, I really want to separate out two parts of that. One is the decision problem. So I ran my phase 2 trial. I got results. I'm looking at those results. I'm looking out at the market. I'm talking to my economists. I'm talking to other people. And I'm deciding, okay, given these results, should I take this drug into phase 3? So we're going to think of that part of it as, as the entry probability. And we're going to think about success as a little differently. We're going to think about success as, did my trial complete? Do I have results from my trial? Okay? And so what we're trying to get at is, I ran a trial, but there was some safety issues and we had to stop. Okay, so I'm going to think of that as a failure. Or I ran a trial and we got through, completed, and then there was data that came out. I'm going to call that a success, that there was data that came out of the trial. It might not be good. It could be good. I don't really know. And I'm actually not using, to the extent that that information is available in clinicaltrials.gov, I'm not using it. So this is sort of why we're actually using both Cortalis and clinicaltrials.gov. Cortalis tells us if we take a set of drugs that we know completed a phase 2 trial, then we say, okay, this is the set of drugs that are available to enter to phase 3, okay? And we see that entry in the Cortalis data, but we get a set from clinicaltrials.gov because we know that they completed their phase 2 trial. Once they've entered phase 3, for example, then we use clinicaltrials.gov again to say, did that trial end? Did it complete? So, okay. Anna, wait for the...
One idea, because a lot of these policies affect the US returns, but less so the worldwide returns, so that ratio can be important. To just approximate it, like getting 1 year of worldwide sales, so you know the ratio between US and worldwide, and then you could maybe do some type of projection over the product life, and also taking into account when it was approved in Europe and other big markets. Just a thought.
Yeah. So, yeah, thank you, Anna. And yeah, we're going to write all these down and sort of think through them. Okay. So I want to talk about the data and the bits that we're estimating. So one part we're estimating is the lifetime revenue for the drug, and Amitabh got this a little bit. These are very, very skewed distributions. So this is in a log. Here we're seeing in log scale. These are estimates of lifetime revenue. So the way we do that is in our data, we don't get to see the whole, say, 35 years of drug revenue, right? We don't see that in the data. What we do see in the data is, the 10th to the 15th year, we see that for a particular drug, or its first 3 years, we see that for a particular drug. So what we need to do is need to fill in all those missing years. And the way we do that is with regression. Am I allowed to say regression? Is with regression. And so we're going to take, I'm not going to say polynomial, okay? We're going to take a regression. We're going to think about when we're seeing that revenue and how long since it entered the market, and that's going to allow us. Those regressions are going to allow us to impute the missing years that we don't have, and then we have sort of a lifetime for different types of drugs. We have a lifetime revenue for each drug. Then what we do is we use the discount rate from Damodaran, and we go back to when they entered the market, and that gives us one number. So now we have one number as lifetime revenue for the drug, and what these plots are is the distribution of that one number across different types of drugs. And what it shows is, because we have this granular data, we can do these distributions for different types of drugs. So we see that biologics tend to have higher revenue. Go for it.
How do you get around, I know I've asked this before, but how do you get around the problem that you have a data set, you're trying to say how much does drug earn over its life cycle? So I'm going to look at what happens in year 0 to 3 of this drug, and 7 to 8 of that drug, and so on and so forth. But in year 12, you only seen certain types of drugs that are still there, right? There's selection into who's sticking around, and how do you account for that?
So part of it is we do the estimate. I'm really not allowed to say quantile, am I?
We'll allow it.
What?
We'll allow it this once.
We do the estimate for different parts of the distribution. So what we do see, like in the data, we see that drugs that tend to have lower revenue tend to also finish earlier, and chemical drugs tend to both have lower revenue and tend to finish earlier. Biological drugs tend to have higher revenue and tend to have a lot longer time period. So that's part of it. But part of it is also making still pretty strong assumptions in our modeling. And so to some extent we do and should worry about that. And I think we're interested if people have thoughts on exactly that question. How should we make adjustments to our model? Given I was looking at Enbrel. Enbrel's been on the market, I think, 26 years, and that may be the longest in the data. I wasn't sure if there was anything longer than that. And I think it last year made $3.3 billion out of 26 years. But we would like a model that goes out longer, even longer than that. So out to 30 years. Maybe it doesn't matter that much, as Amitabh pointed out, if you're like 10 times out at 30 years, does it make any difference to our estimate? I'm not sure it does. And Amitabh is shaking his head and saying no. So that's a revenue. Amitabh.
So something that I don't know the answer to is if you look at the relationship between analyst forecasts of sales and actual sales. So you wait for, time to reveal the actual sales. The two distributions are actually quite different. So analysts get a lot of things wrong. They, on average, seem to be quite right. So let me start with that.
Okay.
But they're certainly not expecting Enbrel to generate $3 billion in year 25.
Right.
And if I was running a large pharmaceutical company and I'm on the earnings call, I'm thinking about analysts. I'm not thinking about this sort of windfall that might happen.
Right.
And so what's relevant for the R&D decision is not the actual, but the best guess, right? And I worry a little bit that trying to fill in income can get us into a situation where we think more revenue is needed than is actually needed.
Yeah, that's
Now, this whole thing could be, I could also argue it the other way, which is that maybe the model that investors use is 80% of the return is quote unquote rational, and there's a 20% tip that I get, which I still need, by the way, just to be clear. I still need it to make the whole thing work.
Right.
And I want to take that very seriously. I don't want to say just because it wasn't in the DCF, it wasn't important. So I'm just stuck there.
Yeah. So, our approach is going to be, what econometricians call rational expectations, right? So, you're going to believe that you're going to earn the revenue you actually do earn, right? That's what rational expectation is. When you're thinking through this decision problem and you go onto the market, you earn the revenue that you thought you were going to earn, right? So they're able to perfectly predict that revenue, and so that's a standard approach, at least in IO, which is sort of where I come from. But you're right, and some of the researchers are using analysts' report. I've talked with friends and academic colleagues about exactly this problem, and should we use analyst reports, or should we do an approach like this? We've decided to do an approach like this, but again, if somebody comes along and says, look, if you do it using analyst reports, you get these results, and you should think about it that way. I think we're open to that. So this is the revenue side. We're also, on the cost side, we're using this data set that comes from Wouters et al. This is a data set of public companies. So another thing I didn't mention about the SSR Health data, it's public companies. We have actually two experts on SSR Health here, Anna and Joe. So if you have questions about SSR Health data, ask them. But that data is from public companies. The Wouters data is also from public companies, but they sort of have to be sort of Goldilocks companies in that they have to be small enough that analysts and others care about how much they're spending on particular drugs in development. And then they have to be big enough to be public. So there are a group of companies that report publicly how much they've actually spent on particular drugs to the SEC or to analysts. The nice thing about it is that it's available, it's cheap, which is good for CBO, and it's at a very granular level. You can do it by drug. So, we can do, basically we can do something similar to what Joe Damasi did and present, the distribution of costs. These are capitalized costs for the different phases, and we see that phase 3 costs are a lot more than phase 1 costs. And then we can also do something similar for different types of drugs. Although this probably has something to do with the data itself, but the distributions are a lot tighter across the different types of drugs. Maybe biological drugs are a little bit more expensive to develop. Then we have the Cortalis data. So this data set's a lot bigger. What we're doing with this data set is, back to Colleen's question, is we're trying to estimate, did this drug complete the trial, right? Did it get results? And so failure would be, maybe there was some safety issue and that's why it failed. Maybe there was a recruiting issue, so they ended up shutting the trial down because they couldn't recruit patients. But those are sort of failures. You didn't actually get results. If it completed and got results, whether good or bad, we say that is a success. This data allows us to give different estimates for different types of drugs. Don't worry about any of these numbers or any of the stars or anything like that. But just to say that, it's easier to get through phase 1 than phase 3. It's easier to be an oral drug than a cancer drug. Okay, so we have all these estimates. We have these. SSR Health gives us by drug annual revenue for a bunch of years, and then we use that to impute lifetime revenues for each of the drugs in the SSR Health data. We have the Wooters data, which gives us how much the company spends on the drug in different phases of development, and we use that number to capitalize out those costs. But all this information is what economists would call selected or biased, right? We only see revenue for the drugs that actually got to market, right? We're not seeing the revenue for the drugs where the company decided not to bring it. And we start to get a sense of the issue in this data. So this is just what I've done here is I merged the SSR Health data with the Wooters data. So for each triangle or square or whatever circle, I don't know what they are, circle? I think it's a circle, is a particular drug, and for that drug, I see its lifetime revenue and its capitalized costs for the different phases. And the way we're going to think about this is if a drug is in this area, so above the dashed line to the left, it's profitable. So their revenues are greater than their costs. If a drug is in this area, it's unprofitable, and they should sort of make the no-go decision, right? If I'm down here, I shouldn't go into the next phase. So what we would expect is the data to just sit up here, right? That's what we'd expect. We wouldn't tend to see, a really high phase 2 cost drug with really low revenue, right? We just wouldn't expect to see that. However, in our model, we need to know the drugs that sit down here, right? The drugs we don't see. So we need that in our model to think through the policies and the decisions. So, you know, if drugs were suddenly going to make more money, then there would be this line would, well, I think, you know, there are more money. So this whole thing would shift up. So a bunch of drugs that were here would suddenly get above the line. So we want to know how many drugs are sitting below the line that would shift up. How do we do that? We use that model. So we're going to look at our data. We're going to look at the actual decisions of firms like Eli Lilly to take a drug into phase 1, to take a drug into phase 2, phase 3. And what we're going to have them project out and say, well, how much are we going to make from this drug, and how much is it going to cost us? And you know, if our revenue is going to be higher than our costs, then we're going to go in. So we're going to use the sort of machinery of the model to allow us to back out what these missing drug values are, okay? Alice.
So looking at it, it looks like in phase 3, there's a positive relationship between cost and revenue. Is it worrying that in phase 1 it looks negative, or maybe I'm reading this wrong?
No, that's right. So in terms of the modeling, if we're seeing a positive relationship between costs and revenue, that's suggestive, again, that we have a selection issue in our data, right? We're only seeing, when we're seeing high costs, we're only seeing that because they earn high revenue. When we're seeing low revenue, we're only seeing that because they have low costs. So that will tend to, you know, I think your natural inclination is that you would see a positive correlation because of that. So I know. I was happy to see at least some positive lines. I'm just an optimist like that. You know, I think it raises the question, you know, do we have the same selection issue going back to phase 1? Like, you know, how big a selection issue do we have with drugs going into phase 1? Is it more of a sort of random, there's more randomness, you know, they just don't know what's going to happen, you know, with the revenue of that drug. In our modeling, so in our model, we're going to allow that there to be correlation between phase 1 and future revenue. But when we go to phase 0, we're going to still assume that there is no correlation. So that thanks, Ben. So that for a company taking a drug into preclinical testing, that we're sort of assuming they don't really have any idea how much revenue that thing is going to make. Again, this is just to show that I have a big data set. We're going to use this information, like I was saying before, we're going to use this information about this decision to take a drug that successfully completed its phase 2 trial. We're going to look at that decision to enter phase 3, and from that decision, we're going to infer what their costs and revenues are, okay? From the observed decision and the modeling assumptions that we're making.
Chris, so this makes sense to me that you take a model of, well, I guess maybe I thought maybe revenue was going to affect this decision. So maybe that's one question. But a second question is, then later, if you alter the revenue, then maybe, like you were saying, you get more drugs above the line, but I haven't gotten a sense of what you put in for the revenue for those drugs that now they enter the market. You know, they don't have revenue in your data. Is it a draw, or is there a demand model that you didn't tell us about?
So I'm going to do two parts of that. I'm going to 3 parts. How much time do I have? I have revenues for a bunch of different drugs. I have lifetime. I see some of those drugs in the data itself. So I can say, okay, for this drug, not only do I get to see its decision, but I also get to see actually how much it made. So I'm just going to say, well, they knew that they were going to get that amount. For other drugs, I don't get to see what they were, maybe because the data's missing or maybe because they never got to the phase. So for those, I'm going to take their characteristics and I'm going to say, okay, they have, they're similar to this other drug. I'm going to use that. And then I'm going to use the model to back out the unobserved component. So I'm talking to economists, so so we're going to back out the unobserved component using the model. So all of those things. It's on the website. I think it came onto the website maybe 5 minutes ago, so it's up there. Oops. So I'm very grateful to Ben give us the opportunity to present to this audience. Our goal here is to provide you with information about how we're thinking about this very important problem, and reach out to experts who have thought about maybe not all the problem but some of the problem, and get their feedback. So this is ongoing updates. We're continuing to update the model. So if you have ideas, our door is open. So please let us know. And again, thank you, Ben.
People are more than welcome to stay, hang out, and chat, but we can wrap up the formal proceedings now. I want to say thank you to Amitav, Alice, and Chris for their very insightful presentations, so please join me. I think this probably goes for all the speakers, but feel free to follow up with suggestions, thoughts, criticisms, whatever, and hopefully this is the start of more conversations than it is just a single event. So thank you all very much for coming, and see you guys next time.